The water reclamation unit failed on the second morning. I had been expecting it. I had not been expecting how quiet the failing would be, just a small light shifting from green to amber, and then nothing. No alarm. No final sound. Just a color change and the soft sense of something reaching its limit. I had been awake when it happened. I had not slept much. My vessel was an Ethon-class scout, designated DR-7, and what remained of it was a crumpled piece of alloy half buried in an ash field near the equatorial scar of Carith-9. The impact had destroyed my primary drive and had punched the navigation console through the co-pilot seat I had been occupying 3 seconds before the crash. 3 seconds earlier and this would have been a different kind of report. Or no report at all. My left secondary limb was broken in 2 places. My translator module had taken a fragment hit and now operated at a half-second delay, which meant every sound in the world reached me twice, once as itself and once as something I could understand. My emergency beacon was transmitting on the standard Dominion frequency. Whether anyone was receiving it was a calculation I had run twice and set aside. The probability of rescue before my water supply ran out, 11.4%. I had confirmed this number 4 times. Numbers do not change because you want them to. The Keth teach this early and without softness. We are a species that prefers correct information over comfortable information. This has won us many things and cost us others, and I had spent enough years in the field to know that sometimes the things it cost were worth the loss, and sometimes they were not, and most days you could not tell the difference while you were still inside the situation. I inventoried my remaining supplies in the forward section of the cockpit, where the hull was still intact and the wind could not reach. 14 ration tablets. 6 water reclamation cycles before the unit gave out. 1 functioning medkit. 1 signal flare. 1 sidearm with 4 charges. Outside, the wind moved through the ash field with a sound that was almost rhythmic. I had been listening to it for 2 days. On the first afternoon I had found it unsettling. By the second morning it had become background noise, which was its own kind of information about where my psychological calibration was sitting. Carith-9 does not appear on any Dominion survival chart. It had appeared briefly in a tactical archive 13 years ago, as the site of an engagement between Dominion forward forces and a species that had since gone silent across all communication channels. The record had been flagged and reviewed and quietly archived in a database that required 3 clearance levels to access. I had 2 of those levels. I had read the record anyway. The surviving field report from that engagement contained 31 words of usable information and 1 sentence that had stayed with me longer than any formal briefing I had ever received. Do not attempt to evaluate them by any standard metric. The standard metrics do not apply. I thought about that sentence on the 3rd morning when my passive scanner registered the biosignature. Bipedal. Warm-blooded. Mass distribution consistent with a large and heavily built frame. Internal temperature 37.2 degrees Celsius. Stride length approximately 1.1 meters, consistent with a being covering ground with clear intention. The species designation populated before I had finished processing the raw numbers. Human. I had been 8 cycles old when I first learned what that word meant in a survival context. The instructor had been a careful woman who taught the Dominion preparedness curriculum without drama. She had said it the way adults say things they want to become part of a child's permanent structure, not loudly, but with precision. If you are ever alone and you register this biosignature, she had said, do not attempt to hide. Do not attempt to negotiate. You will not succeed at either. Every Keth child learns 3 things before their first reading assignment: the name of the Dominion's founding prime, the continuity formula for colony collapse scenarios, and what humans are recorded as capable of when they encounter someone alone in an uncontrolled environment. I could not run. The secondary limb would not hold my weight at any meaningful pace. The wreck was not large enough to conceal me from sensors this basic. I had 4 charges and the documented survival record of this species against comparable weapons was not encouraging. I picked up the sidearm. I released the safety. I moved to the forward section of the cockpit and put my back against what remained of the instrument panel and faced the torn opening where the main access hatch had been before the impact distributed it across the ash field. I was not going to turn away from it. If the next few minutes were the last calculation I was ever going to run, I was going to be looking at whatever was coming. That was the one thing I could still choose and I was going to take it. The footsteps stopped just outside. A silence. Long enough that I started to wonder if I had misread the sensor, if the signature had moved away, and then the opening filled. He was large in a way that the data had prepared me for and that my eyes still found difficult to process. The thermal scarring on the left side of his face ran from his jaw to above his ear in a pattern that suggested prolonged exposure to something that had burned at high temperature for a long time. He carried visible weapons in 3 locations on his frame. His eyes moved across the cockpit interior in one smooth sweep, organized, fast, thorough, and then settled on the sidearm in my hand. Then on my face. He did not reach for any of his weapons. My translator rendered his first word half a beat behind his mouth. Easy. I kept the sidearm level. My functioning hand was steady. I had very little left, but I still had that and I was going to keep it. He looked at my broken secondary limb. He looked at the medkit on the floor beside me. He looked at the water unit with its amber warning light. He unslung the large carry pack from his back and set it on the floor slowly, with both hands visible, and then he crouched. It brought his eye level closer to mine. He was still the largest organism I had ever been in a closed space with. Crouching did not change that. The gesture was deliberate and I could see that it was deliberate, and I made a note of it and then told myself the note was simply tactical data. "I'm going to help you," the translator said in his voice and then in mine, half a second behind. I did not lower the sidearm. He did not seem to expect me to. He opened the carry pack and began removing items with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before and was not thinking about how it looked from the outside. A compact water filtration unit. A medical kit that made mine look like a field toy. Several sealed ration packs. A portable heat source, small and clearly designed for one person. He set the heat source 3 meters from me and turned it on without asking. The warmth reached me in seconds. My body responded to it the way a body responds to warmth after 3 days of cold, which is to say it responded without consulting me first. He said something else then. The translator caught it a half-beat late. "What's your name?" I held the sidearm steady. "Irene. Vessel Scout Irene, Dominion designation 37 Keth." He nodded once. Like I had confirmed a data point he had already suspected. "Owen," he said. Just the one word. Like a name was a simple thing to offer someone who was pointing a weapon at you. Like it was perfectly ordinary to introduce yourself in a damaged cockpit on a hostile planet to a being who had every historical and statistical reason to assume the worst of you. He reached into the medical kit and removed a composite splint brace and a length of stabilization wrap. He held them up where I could see them clearly. "Your arm," he said. The translator gave me the words a half-beat later. "I need to set it or it will heal wrong. This will hurt for about 30 seconds. Then it will hurt less." I looked at the splint materials. I looked at him. I ran a probability assessment on his intentions so fast it barely qualified as conscious thought and arrived at no useful conclusion, because there was no existing framework in my training or my experience that accounted for this precise combination of variables. He waited. He was very good at waiting. That was the third thing I noticed about him, after the size and the scarring. He had a patience that did not seem like restraint. It seemed like he had simply decided to wait and had no particular discomfort with the waiting itself. I lowered the sidearm. Not all the way. Just enough to be practical. He moved forward, slowly, and got to work. The splint took 4 minutes. It hurt for 32 seconds, by my internal count. Then, as he had said, it hurt less. He sat back when he was finished, and looked at the water unit again. "That I can fix too," he said, and pointed at the amber light. I was still holding the sidearm. I was also watching the portable heat source, that small orange glow 3 meters away. I told myself I was keeping track of it as an environmental variable. I knew that was not why I was watching it. He fixed the water unit in 11 minutes. I counted. He did not narrate what he was doing. He did not explain each step or look at me to see if I was following. He opened the side panel, examined the filtration column, replaced a component from his carry pack, and closed the panel again. The light went from amber back to green. I stared at it for a moment longer than was strictly professional. He stood, moved back to his carry pack, and retrieved 2 sealed ration packs. He set one on the floor in front of me, not close enough that he had to reach into my space, but within easy reach, and opened the other for himself. "Eat," he said. The translator gave me the word a half-beat late, in the flat galactic common his species used when it wanted to communicate with everyone and connect with no one. I looked at the ration pack. I looked at him. "I am not hungry," I said. This was not entirely accurate. He looked at me with the kind of expression I would later learn to recognize as the one he made when he had already decided how something was going to go but was giving the situation one more moment to arrive at the correct conclusion on its own. Then he ate his ration without further comment and waited. I ate the ration pack. It tasted like a human being's idea of nutritional adequacy, competent and completely without joy. But it was food, and I had been running on 14 Keth tablets for 3 days, and my body accepted it with a gratitude my mind was not ready to endorse. He watched the ash field while I ate. Not watching me. Watching the perimeter. I noted this. After we ate, he told me in careful galactic common that there was a defensible position approximately 1.4 kilometers northeast, an outcrop formation with natural overhead cover and a single approach path. "We need to move tomorrow morning," he said. "Before the thermal cycle peaks. Your limb can handle the distance at a slow pace." Your limb. Not, if your limb can handle it, or, do you think you can manage? Just a statement of his assessment. I wanted to dispute it on principle and could not find a factual basis for doing so. "How do you know the formation is there?" I asked. He showed me his scanner, a human military model, compact and more capable than mine had been before the crash. The outcrop was exactly where he said it was. He had already mapped 3 alternate approach routes, 2 of which accounted for the prevailing wind direction and 1 of which I would have chosen myself. I handed his scanner back without commenting on this. That night he took the first watch without discussing the arrangement. He simply positioned himself at the opening in the hull, the same opening I had been facing with the sidearm when he arrived, and sat with his back partially to me and his eyes on the ash field. I lay against the instrument panel with my repaired secondary limb extended, and I did not sleep. I told myself I was monitoring the situation. I watched him sit at the opening and I ran a probability assessment. Given his positioning, his body language, his resource investment so far, what was the most strategically consistent explanation for his behavior? The framework I had been given said that humans formed apparent bonds with those they found in vulnerable positions as a precursor to exploitation. The patience and the care and the resource sharing were consistent with this model, if you were willing to read them as preparatory. I was willing to read them as preparatory. It was the correct precaution. And yet, the heat source was still burning 3 meters away. He had not deactivated it when we moved into night hours. The water unit light was green. The ration pack had been sealed before he handed it to me, which meant it had not been modified after the fact. I filed these as anomalies and continued monitoring. Sometime past the 2nd hour of his watch, he said something very quietly, in his own language, like a person talking to themselves while their hands are busy. My translator struggled with his native language and rendered it imperfectly. Something like, "Structural integrity, front section, questionable, will need reinforcement in the morning, heat unit at 60% capacity, noted." He was narrating an inspection of the shelter. The way a person narrates a to-do list when there is no one else to say it to, out of habit, because he was a being who thought out loud when he was alone and had apparently forgotten, for the moment, that he was not. I lay against the instrument panel and said nothing and listened to him murmur a maintenance checklist to the ash field outside. 3 hours into his watch, he looked back at me. I had my eyes mostly closed. He checked, a brief, non-intrusive assessment, and then turned back to the opening. "Get some sleep," he said. Quiet. Not a command. Not quite an offer. Something in between that I did not have a category for. I did not sleep. But my grip on the sidearm loosened by a degree that I told myself was simply fatigue. In the morning, he had already broken down the portable heat source and repacked it before I was fully alert. He had refilled the water unit and set a full collection beside my position. He had done all of this without waking me. He was eating a second ration pack when I registered full awareness. He handed me one. I took it without running the calculation this time. I noted this as a small thing and moved on. We left for the outcrop formation an hour after first light. He adjusted his pace to mine without acknowledging that he was doing it. The ash field was firm under the surface layer and my secondary limb managed the distance without causing the kind of pain that required me to stop and recalibrate. He walked slightly to my left and slightly behind. I analyzed this and analyzed it again and could not place it in any clear threat model. It was a position that put him between me and the most exposed side of our route. I had noticed this after approximately 400 meters. I did not say anything about it. The outcrop was exactly where he said it would be. Deeper than his scanner had suggested, drier, with a natural wind barrier on the dominant weather side. He stood in the middle of it and looked around with the expression of a person doing a quiet architectural review. "This will do," he said. I sat down against the rear wall and looked at the light coming through the entry and at the ash field beyond it and at the gray sky above the equatorial scar, and I thought, with a precision that my training would have been proud of. 11.4% had been the number. I had not run it since he arrived. I set the sidearm on the ground beside me, still within reach, and watched the entry point and told myself I was keeping watch. He was already unpacking the portable heat source. He set it exactly 3 meters from me. I stared at that small orange glow and thought about the warmth reaching me without my permission and thought about how the color was the same color it had been in the wreck and thought about nothing at all for a while. Which was, by any honest measurement, very unusual for me. He did not speak much. This was a fact I had not expected and had not prepared for. The humans in every account I had ever accessed, field reports, tactical assessments, the cultural briefings the Dominion issued to scouts before sending them into known contact zones, were described as loud. As beings who filled silence because silence made them uncomfortable. Owen Crane was quiet. He moved through the outcrop space with an efficiency that left no wasted motion. He positioned the equipment with the habit of someone who had set up field camps so many times the process had become reflex. He checked the entry point twice, walked the perimeter of the outcrop's outer face, and came back inside. Then he sat down, produced a small maintenance tool from his kit, and began servicing one of his weapons. Not for display. Actually servicing it, checking components, testing mechanisms, the way a person maintains a piece of equipment they rely on. I watched him do this and ran the calculation. If his intention was harm, he would not need to maintain the weapon in front of me. The display of maintenance was either a dominant signal or it was simply what it appeared to be, a person taking care of his tools. I could not determine which. He looked up after a while and found me watching. "Do you know how to use that?" He nodded at my sidearm on the floor beside me. "Yes," I said. "Good." He returned to the work. No follow-up. No offer to inspect my weapon or demonstrate his competence. Just, "Good." "Why good?" I asked. He considered this for a moment. "Because I only have 2 hands," he said, "and this is a big ash field." He said it without looking up. The tone my translator gave me was dry, matter-of-fact, the tone of someone acknowledging a simple logistical reality. I sat with that for a moment. 2 hands. Big ash field. He was not pretending there was no danger. He was treating it as a shared problem rather than a personal advantage. I did not have a framework for that either. The afternoon passed. He cooked, or what passed for cooking on field rations, which involved a small heating element and a foil packet and produced something that smelled better than it had any right to. He made 2 portions. He slid one to me without comment. I ate it without the pause I had taken the first time. He noticed. I am certain he noticed. He did not say anything about it. 2 days into traveling with Owen Crane, I had developed a list of things that did not fit the framework. It was not a short list. I will not recount the full catalog because several entries require context that would take longer to explain than the list is worth. But the most operationally significant ones were these. First, he talked to his equipment. Not expecting a response, just narration. When the portable water filter became slow on the second afternoon, he told it, in a tone of mild professional disappointment, that he understood it was doing its best but he needed it to do slightly better. The filter did not improve. He worked around the limitation with the patient resignation of someone accustomed to things failing at inconvenient moments. Second, he found things funny. Small things. On the first morning of our overland travel he had tripped on a ridge of hardened ash and caught himself and then stood for a moment looking at the ridge with an expression that seemed to involve both irritation and appreciation at the same time. Then he made a quiet sound I identified, after a delay, as laughter. He had nearly fallen. He found this amusing. I filed it under anomalies and moved on. Third, and this was the entry I returned to most often, he was never surprised by effort. Most beings have a cost threshold, a point at which they recalibrate their output against the expected return. At the point where the investment of effort exceeds the projected benefit, they adjust downward. Owen Crane did not appear to have this threshold. Or if he had it, it was located somewhere I could not find on any scale I knew how to read. We reached the first navigation point on schedule. The second required a route correction because a section of the terrain had shifted, old volcanic activity, recent, the ash still soft and dangerous underfoot. He identified the hazard 50 meters before I would have, changed our approach without commentary, and added 22 minutes to our travel time. He did not mention the 22 minutes. I mentioned it. I noted it as a logistical variable in our rescue window calculation. He looked at me for a moment. "We've got time," he said. "We have less time than we had before the correction," I said. "We have enough," he said. These were different statements. I was correct. He was also, it turned out, correct. The distinction between them was something I was still working on. On the afternoon of the third day we found the shelter site he had been targeting, a secondary outcrop with better thermal properties than the first, larger, with a natural cistern collecting clean runoff from a higher ridge. Good water. Solid overhead structure. A genuinely functional position. We built the camp there. I am a trained field operative. I have constructed emergency shelters in 9 documented hostile environments. I know how to build a shelter. Owen Crane also knew how to build a shelter. This was not in dispute. The problem was that we had been given, by the terrain, a set of structural variables open to interpretation, and our interpretations differed in ways we did not discover until the first support brace failed. The brace failure took the entire left side of the initial frame down. He caught the main panel before it reached me, which required him to move fast and brace the weight with both hands while I scrambled backward, and then hold it there while we looked at each other through the gap where a wall had been. He said something in his own language. The translator gave me, that was not the plan. I looked at the collapsed frame. I looked at him holding the panel with both hands and a very specific expression. The load distribution calculation was incorrect, I said. Yep, he said. Your calculation, specifically, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Yep, he said again, with the same tone, and then, can you take that section? I took the section. We rebuilt the left side with a different load distribution. It held. He stood back and looked at it with the expression of a being making a genuine structural assessment and said, better, in the tone of someone who considers an improvement sufficient and has no interest in dwelling on the version that failed. I had never met anyone who moved on from being wrong that efficiently. I had never met anyone who admitted being wrong that directly while still holding a structural panel over my head with both hands. I filed this under anomalies, subcategory, requires further data. The evening was uneventful until the fauna found us. Carith 9's native biology is predominantly ambush-based. The species that occupies the mid-sized predator niche in this biome has no common name in the Dominion catalog because the Dominion has not cataloged it, and it was therefore a complete tactical surprise when one of them launched itself from the ridge above the entry point at approximately the speed of a decision you have already committed to before thinking it through. I had my sidearm up in the same moment Owen moved. He moved faster. What happened in the next 2 seconds was not dramatic in the visual sense. He simply intercepted the trajectory of the creature before it reached me, redirected its momentum, and put himself between the impact point and my position. The creature's secondary strike caught him across the left side of his torso before he fully contained the situation. It left a wound. Significant by my assessment. The kind of wound that, in a field context without proper treatment, compounds. He stood for a moment, breathing. Then he put his hand against his side and checked the damage with the brisk, administrative manner of a being doing an inventory. Okay, he said to no one in particular. That's fair. I stared at him. You should not have been in that position, I said. My translator gave the words in flat galactic common and they sounded more clinical than I intended. The trajectory was manageable. I was armed. He looked at me. His expression was the one I still did not have a full translation for, the one that made my translator feel as though it was missing several layers of information below the surface of the words. You couldn't have moved in time, he said. That was it. That was the full explanation. He said it the way you state a fact about a fixed condition, the way you say the ground is sloped or the water runs downhill. Not a declaration. Not a sacrifice narrated for effect. Just a logistical assessment delivered after the fact. I could not have moved in time. He had moved instead. This was, to him, a sequence of cause and effect with no moral weight attached, no transaction recorded, nothing owed or given. I moved toward him with the medkit. He let me treat the wound without protest. He sat against the shelter wall and watched the entry point while I worked and gave no indication that the pain was significant beyond a brief tightening around his eyes when I applied the sealant compound, gone almost immediately. This requires monitoring, I told him when I finished. A wound in this location, in this environment, can deteriorate quickly without proper assessment. I know, he said. You should tell me if it worsens, I said. He looked at me with a shift in his expression that I later understood was something between surprise and something else I did not have a word for. Okay, he said. I will. That night I ran the survival probability calculation. I ran it twice before I realized I had not run it in the past 6 hours. 6 hours. I had been so occupied with the shelter construction, the fauna encounter, the wound treatment, the operational variables, I had simply not run the number. I ran it now. 54%. 54% and rising, contingent on the rescue window remaining open and the wound not deteriorating and the terrain between here and the extraction point remaining passable. I looked at Owen sitting at the entry point on his watch, his hand resting occasionally at his side as if confirming the wound was still there and still contained. 54% was not certain. But it was the furthest from 11.4 I had been since I landed. I had not run it in 6 hours because I had been busy. That was the only reason. I was certain of it. In the morning he was worse than the night before, which I had calculated as a 62% probability, and he was also moving and conducting his morning perimeter check before I was fully alert, which I had not calculated at all. I watched him walk the perimeter and noted that he was favoring his left side by approximately 3%, a nearly invisible adjustment in gait that only registered because I had been watching him move for 3 days and had, without deciding to, catalogued his baseline. You said you would tell me if it worsened, I said when he came back in. It's manageable, he said. Which was not what I had asked. That is not an answer to what I said. He sat down, looked at me, and then had the specific expression of a person who has been caught being imprecise and is choosing between acknowledging it and continuing to be imprecise. He chose acknowledgement. It's worse than last night, he said. Not by a dangerous margin. I know what dangerous feels like. I took that statement apart for a moment. I know what dangerous feels like. Said with the certainty of direct experience, multiple instances, significant sample size. Let me look at it, I said. He let me look at it. It was worse but it was manageable, and I redressed the wound with the last of the sealant compound and told him the treatment was holding and tried not to think about the weight of the phrase, I know what dangerous feels like, and what it implied about the history of a being I had spent 3 days building a partial framework for. He thanked me. Briefly, simply, thank you, Irene, with my name at the end of it, which was the first time he had used my name since I had given it to him on the first day. I did not have an immediate response to this. I returned to my position against the wall and looked at the entry point and thought about how a name sounds different when someone has carried it for 3 days before choosing to use it. I thought about this for longer than was strictly necessary. Then I ran the survival probability again. 57%, given the wound status. I noted the number. I did not find it as cold as numbers used to feel. This also required more thought than I gave it. The scavengers arrived on the 4th day, an hour before the estimated rescue window. I was in the back of the outcrop running an updated probability calculation when the scanner registered them, 3 biosignatures, armed, approaching from the southwest at a pace that was not casual. Not the pace of beings passing through. The pace of beings who had picked up our thermal signature and had made a decision about it. I said Owen's name. He was across the shelter in 2 steps. He looked at my scanner without touching it, read the data, assessed the approach vectors, calculated the distances, and then he picked up his primary weapon and moved to the entry point. "Stay behind the rear formation," he said. He did not say it as an instruction to someone who needed to be protected. He said it the way you position a second element in a tactical deployment, a practical geometry, the most efficient use of available resources. I moved to the rear formation. I had the sidearm. The scavengers were not Keth. I had seen this species twice before in my field career, a low-coordination predator group that operated on opportunistic logic, the kind of calculus that evaluated every situation as, what can I take, what will I lose, is the balance favorable? Effective in encounters with isolated or weakened targets. We were technically both. Isolated, certainly. Weakened, in Owen's case, though not visibly so from a distance. The first one came through the entry point. I will describe what I saw as precisely as I am able, because precision is the only way I have to convey it accurately without losing the detail in language that is not built to carry it. He was fast. Not fast in the way that is visible as speed, not a blur, nothing that registers as exceptional until you try to locate where he was half a second ago and realize the distance does not add up. He moved as though he had mapped every surface in the outcrop before the encounter began, which he had, because I had watched him walk the space methodically on our first morning here and had thought he was simply restless. He was not restless. He was building a map. He had been building a map since we arrived. The first was contained in 4 seconds. I will not detail the specifics. What I will say is this: the 4 seconds were efficient and they were controlled, and when they were over, the first scavenger was no longer a tactical variable in our situation. The second came through the entry simultaneously with the first, which told me they had done this before, the coordinated double entry, pressure from 2 angles, the geometry designed to split a defender's attention. It was a sound tactical approach. Owen's attention did not split. I will not describe the second 4 seconds either. The third did not come through the entry. The third, reading the situation from the approach position outside, made the choice that was available to them and took it. By the time the entry was clear, the third biosignature was moving away on my scanner at the pace of a being who has recalculated the balance of the situation and found it no longer favorable. Owen stood at the entry and watched the third signature retreat on his own scanner. His hand was at his left side, at the wound location. His breathing was controlled, but it was not effortless. I could read the effort in it from where I was standing. He turned around. He looked at me. He crossed the space to where I was standing at the rear formation and checked me with his eyes, a quick, systematic sweep assessing for injury, and when he found none he did a thing I was not expecting. He sat down against the rear wall and put his head back and closed his eyes for a moment. Not a long moment. 10 seconds, perhaps. But real. A real moment of something coming down. Then he opened his eyes and started checking the wound at his side with his expression back to the administrative flatness he wore when he was being practical about himself. I came and sat beside him. I did not ask. I simply sat and opened the medkit. He let me without discussion. I worked in silence for a while. The wound had not torn further, the physical exertion had strained the sealant but not broken through it, and the redressing was straightforward. While I worked, I was aware that I was sitting very close to him and that this would have been, 4 days ago, a fact I registered entirely within a threat framework. It was not in a threat framework now. I did not know exactly when that had changed. I had not been given a clear moment where it changed. It had moved incrementally, through a sequence of small recalibrations, until the position I was in now was simply the position I was in. When I finished, I sat back and looked at the entry point and at the light in the ash field beyond it. The stories were accurate, I said. He was quiet for a moment. He knew which stories I meant. I was certain of it. Yeah, he said. Not, I can explain that. Not, it is not what it looks like. Not a defense or a reframing or an attempt to walk back any part of what I had just witnessed. Just, yeah. The word sat between us in the space of the outcrop and neither of us reached to move it. He was what the Dominion said he was. The capability was real. The record was accurate and I had just watched it, and I was sitting close enough to him that I could hear his breathing, and the breathing was controlled and present and the same as it had been every other time I had been close enough to hear it. Both things were true. The capabilities described in every Dominion intelligence file and the being who fixed the water unit and set the heat source 3 meters from someone cold and said, "You couldn't have moved in time," without making it a story. Both of these were the same being. I had been treating them as a contradiction because it was simpler and because the framework I had been given was not built to hold both things at once. The framework was insufficient. This was not a comfortable conclusion. It was, however, a correct one. The Keth prefer correct information. He shifted beside me and something in the movement made me think of the wound at his side, the way it had looked this morning, the escalating concern in my assessment. "That needs more than field treatment," I said. "When we reach the rescue ship." "Yeah," he said. Different tone this time. Lighter. The tone of a being who knows what needs more treatment means and has had this conversation before, enough times to simply agree. My scanner chirped. I looked at it. The rescue beacon was responding. A Dominion recovery vessel, retrieval class, had picked up the emergency frequency and was triangulating. The return signal gave an estimated window, 4 hours, 20 minutes. I looked at the data. I ran the confirmation calculation. 4 hours, I said. Owen looked at my scanner. He read the numbers with the same flat efficiency he read everything. Then he sat back against the wall and looked at the entry point. "Good," he said. Just the one word. The same word he had used the first morning when I had confirmed I could use the sidearm. I had thought it was a dominant signal then. A predator confirming the competence of a resource. I knew what it was now. I still did not have a single word for it that my language carried cleanly. It lived somewhere in the territory between acknowledgement and satisfaction, between noting a fact and being glad the fact is what it is. He was glad we had 4 hours. I sat against the wall beside him and looked at the entry point and at the ash field and at the gray sky above the equatorial scar, and I was aware of his breathing beside me and of a warmth that had nothing to do with the portable heat source, which was not running. 4 hours. I had not been glad about a number in a very long time. We waited in the outcrop through those 4 hours. Not in silence, he maintained his scanner watch, I monitored the perimeter frequency, both of us running the standard field discipline of beings who have not yet been extracted and have learned not to assume safety until they are inside the hull of something taking them somewhere else. But the particular quality of vigilance had shifted. It was no longer the vigilance of two beings measuring each other's threat profile. It was the vigilance of two beings who had been through several calibrated versions of the same problem together and had arrived at a mutual understanding of how to occupy a shared space without friction. I noticed this. I noticed it the way you notice when a constant sound stops, in the absence of it, when the space it occupied becomes audible. At some point in the second hour he said, without preamble, "Your galactic common is good. Better than most." I looked at him. "I have been using it since basic training," I said. It was a functional requirement. "Sure," he said. "Most people still sound like they're working at it. You sound like you just think in it." I considered this. I have been told that Keth processing structure is well suited to constructed language frameworks. We tend to acquire functional fluency faster than species with more flexible native grammar. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that," he said. "Most species do not," I said. The Dominion curriculum covers the Keth political history and the collective decision protocols and the alliance records. It does not cover the cognitive architecture. "What else doesn't it cover?" he asked. The question was genuinely curious. Not strategic, not the gathering of information for a purpose. Simply the curiosity of a being who found the answer interesting. I thought about this. "It does not cover the blood money," I said. The phrase came out before I had decided to say it. Flat galactic common. 2 words, no elaboration. He looked at me. He did not ask. He waited. "An administrative correction," I said. 11 years ago. My colony cluster's records were removed from the Dominion archive. All of them. He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. Galactic common. The tone was not flat. I noted the tone. I noted the absence of follow-up questions. I noted the way he said it, not the professional condolence of a being performing the correct social response, but something with actual weight in it. It is a fact of the past, I said. It does not affect the current operational parameters. He did not agree with this. I could tell he did not agree with it. He did not say so. He went back to monitoring the scanner. I went back to monitoring the perimeter. The rescue window arrived in 3 hours and 58 minutes. The Dominion recovery vessel Kalin 6 set down in the ash field 200 meters northeast of the outcrop, and I watched its running lights through the entry and felt something that my Keth training did not have a clean Category 4. I would have to think about what to call it later. Owen packed the carry pack with the efficiency he applied to everything: portable heat source last, folded compact, placed in the side compartment where it always went. He picked up the pack and looked at the outcrop for a moment. He looked at it the way you look at a place you know you are leaving. Then he walked toward the entry and I followed him out into the ash field, and the two of us walked toward the recovery vessel's open ramp in the gray light of Careth 9's exhausted sun. The Kalin 6 was a standard Dominion recovery vessel, which meant it was functional and clean and utterly without character in a way the Dominion appeared to consider a design virtue. Everything was in the correct position. Everything was the correct color. The air was the correct temperature for standard Dominion physiological profiles. I sat in the medical bay and let the recovery technician run the assessment on my secondary limb, and I looked at the composite splint Owen had applied 4 days ago. The technician removed it with professional efficiency, and I watched it go into the discard bin, and I told myself this was not a meaningful observation. The secondary limb assessment came back consistent with a field repair performed under non-optimal conditions but executed correctly. The bone alignment was acceptable, the healing trajectory would require 3 weeks in a regenerative wrap, and the original field splinting had likely prevented the kind of misalignment that would have required surgical intervention. The technician said this with the same neutral tone she applied to all her assessments. The field splinting was performed by a human operative, I said. She looked up from her instruments. He knew what he was doing, I said. She made a note. I was not sure what kind of note. She moved on to the fragment cuts from the crash, and I let her work, and I stared at the medical bay ceiling, and I thought about the first 20 minutes of the debrief preparation brief I had received on boarding. Standard recovery protocol. Mandatory after contact with a Class 2 designation species. The debrief would be conducted by Senior Analyst Ren Kale of the Dominion Intelligence Division. It would cover threat profile assessment, behavioral documentation, and the standard Section 4 contact report. Section 4 was the problem. I had read Section 4 before. I had read it as a field operative being prepared for potential contact scenarios. Section 4 was 4 pages of documentation protocol with 17 subfields and a terminology structure designed, very precisely, to confirm what the Dominion already believed about the species it had designated as threats. The language of Section 4 did not have a Category 4, he fixed the water unit. It did not have a Field 4, he set the heat source 3 meters from me and did not ask for acknowledgement. It had no checkbox 4, he said, you couldn't have moved in time, and meant it as a factual observation and not a transaction. These things were not in Section 4 because they were not in the intelligence models that Section 4 had been built to document. Section 4 was a confirmation tool. It was designed to take the experience of contact and process it into a language that maintained the existing assessment. I lay in the medical bay and thought about this for a long time. The technician finished and released me with a regenerative wrap on the secondary limb and a list of restrictions I acknowledged and would partially observe. She told me the debrief would begin in 3 hours. He was in the ship's second medical bay with the wound from the fauna encounter and the compounding stress from the exertion during the scavenger contact. I had checked the medical status board when I boarded. The wound was being treated properly for the first time, under conditions that were not an ash field with a first-generation medkit, and the prognosis was clean. I had confirmed this before I registered that I was looking for it. I sat on the bunk in the recovery section and I did not sleep. I looked at the Dominion gray wall and I thought about the 4 days on Careth 9 with the systematic discipline I applied to all complex data, not trying to arrive at a conclusion, simply letting the information organize itself by weight and relevance. The heat source. This was the image that anchored everything else. Not because it was the largest variable. Not because it was the most operationally significant. Because it had been the first thing he did that did not fit the model, and everything that followed it had been, in some sense, a continuation of the same choice, the choice to put warmth 3 meters from something cold without asking what it was worth. I had eaten his ration pack on the second offer without pausing. I had lowered the sidearm, eventually, to a position of practical compromise rather than active defense, and had never raised it again after that. I had told him about the blood money. I had told him in 2 words and he had heard both of them and had said, "I'm sorry," with actual weight and had not asked me to explain it further. I had not told anyone about the blood money in 11 years. Not because it was secret, the administrative record was publicly accessible to anyone with the right clearance, but because every time I had come close to the edge of saying it, the silence on the other side had been too open, too uncertain, and I had decided the cost of the openness was higher than the cost of the silence. He had not made the silence open. He had simply been in it with me for a moment, and then he had gone back to the scanner. I sat on the bunk and thought about the specific weight of that. 3 hours later I sat across from Senior Analyst Ren Kale in the debrief room, which was the same Dominion gray as everything else and had a small table and 2 chairs and a recording unit and the Section 4 contact documentation form on a tablet between us. Analyst Kale was precise, professional, and entirely uninterested in any information that required him to revise a prior assessment. I made this determination in the first 6 minutes of the debrief. He was skilled at appearing open to revision while being entirely closed to it, a difficult combination that the Dominion promoted reliably through its senior intelligence ranks. He asked the standard questions. I gave the standard answers where they were accurate. I described the crash, the injuries, the terrain, the survival parameters. I described the contact. He became more focused when we reached the contact. "The human operative," he said. "Designation: Sergeant Owen Crane," I said. "Forward Salvage Corps, 14th Division." He made a note. "How was initial contact established?" "He located my crash site using biosignature scanning," I said. "He approached the wreck." "And the initial threat assessment?" "I was armed. I maintained a defensive position." "Did he attempt to secure your weapon?" "No." A brief pause. Analyst Kale noted something. "Did he attempt to restrict your movement?" "No." Another note. "Did he display any threatening behavior during initial contact?" I looked at the tablet with Section 4 open on it. Subfield 4B, did the subject display aggressive or predatory behavior consistent with Class 2 threat designations? I thought about the 4 seconds at the entry point 2 hours before the rescue window. I thought about the second 4 seconds. I thought about the efficiency of it, the absence of hesitation, the complete alignment between the capability in the Dominion's records and the thing I had watched with my own eyes. "Yes," I said. Analyst Kale looked up from his notes with the expression of someone confirming data he expected. "In the context of a defensive response," I said, "to 3 armed individuals who had approached our position with clear hostile intent. The behavior was directed at a threat." The analyst's expression shifted by approximately 1 degree in a direction that did not indicate he found this distinction operationally significant. "Section 4B asks about aggressive or predatory behavior," he said. "Contextual factors are recorded in a separate addendum." "Then the answer to 4B is yes," I said. "And the addendum will require space." He gave me the addendum. I filled it out. I had not been trained in the specific skill of filling out a Dominion intelligence addendum in a way that was technically accurate at every individual data point while being, in aggregate, a portrait of something the standard report language had no vocabulary for. I discovered in this debrief that the skill was available to me when I needed it. I described the water unit repair, technically accurate. Consistent with a subject attempting to maintain the operational capacity of a useful asset. I described the heat source, technically accurate. Consistent with a subject managing the environmental stability of a shared survival position. I described the wound, technically accurate. Consistent with a subject repositioning to neutralize a threat before it reached a secondary operative. I described the ration packs, the pace adjustments, the shelter construction, the fauna encounter, the scavenger response, the 4-hour wait, the walk across the ash field to the recovery ship. All of it technically accurate. All of it missing something that I did not have Section 4 language for. The something was this: the warmth had been real. Not metaphorical. Not strategic. The heat source had been set 3 meters from me and turned on because it was cold and I was cold, and he had a heat source, and the space between those facts, for him, required no calculation. No cost threshold. No expected return. No transaction. The framework I had been given, the one every Keth child was given, the one I had been carrying for 23 years, was not wrong. It had documented something real. The capability was real. The record was accurate, and I had watched it, and I understood it now in a way that a briefing document could describe but could never transmit. But the framework was not finished. It had documented one half of a thing and labeled the half as the whole. And I had almost died in an ash field on a planet that does not appear on Dominion survival charts, believing a half-truth, which is the most dangerous kind of truth there is because it feels complete until the moment it fails you. I signed the addendum. I handed the tablet back to Analyst Kale. He reviewed it with the professional efficiency of someone who would summarize it into the existing assessment model and file it in an archive that required 3 clearance levels to access. He made 3 additional notes. He thanked me for my cooperation. I thanked him in flat galactic common and left the debrief room. Owen was in the corridor outside. This was not expected. He was in a recovery band around his midsection from the wound treatment, and he was carrying his original carry pack, and he was, apparently, also heading somewhere in the direction of the corridor's end. We stood in the Dominion Gray corridor and looked at each other. They said you were in debrief, he said. I was, I said. I am finished. He nodded. The same nod he had used on the first day when I gave him my name, confirming data, nothing wasted. I'm being transferred to the Fleet Medical Station in the Wrath Corridor, he said. Different ship. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. I ran no calculation about what to do with 20 minutes. I simply noted that the corridor was quiet and the Kalen 6 was carrying us both, and in 20 minutes it would not be carrying him. Your wound will be properly treated there, I said. Yeah, he said. They're good at Wrath. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The same kind of silence we had been building for 5 days, the silence of 2 beings who had never needed to fill it. The debrief, he said. Was it all right? I thought about Section 4B. I thought about the addendum that was technically accurate in every individual word and incomplete in every important sense. It was what it was, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved in his expression, the one my translator had never been able to fully carry, and then he did a thing I was not expecting. He held out his hand. A human gesture. The Dominion briefings described it as a formal greeting or farewell. A contact-based acknowledgement between individuals. A gesture of mutual recognition. I looked at it. I looked at him. I took his hand. The grip was firm and brief and completely without threat in any of the ways I had spent 5 days cataloging threats. Take care of that limb, he said. Take care of the wound, I said. He nodded once more. Picked up the carry pack. Walked down the corridor toward the transfer docking bay. I stood in the Dominion Gray corridor and watched him go and did not run any calculation at all for approximately 40 seconds, which was not like me. Then I went back to my bunk in the recovery section. I sat on the bunk and looked at the Dominion Gray wall and thought about the report in Analyst Kale's tablet and the addendum that was true and incomplete and would be filed in a database that would not change the Dominion's assessment of anything. I thought about the ration pack I had eaten on the second offer without pausing. I thought about the heat source, 3 meters away, the same position every time. I thought about, you couldn't have moved in time, and the absence of a transaction in the saying of it. I thought about 2 words in a quiet corridor, I'm sorry, and the weight they had carried, and how he had gone back to the scanner afterward without asking me to acknowledge them, and how I had let the words sit where he had placed them without either of us picking them up again. I thought about the hand in the corridor, firm and brief, and my name said quietly by a being who had been carrying it for 5 days before using it. I had been taught, at the age of 8 cycles, that the standard metrics did not apply. I had run the standard metrics anyway because they were what I had. They had been right about 1/2 of the thing. I opened my personal log file. Not the official report. Not Section 4. My own log, the one that no Dominion clearance level could access because it did not exist in the Dominion archive at all. I had not written in it in 11 years. Not since the blood money. Not since the administrative correction that had removed my colony cluster from the record and taught me, with surgical precision, the cost of putting information in a place where it could be erased. I wrote in it now. I wrote about the heat source. I wrote about the ration pack and the water unit and the splint and the pace adjustments and the wound and the "you couldn't have moved in time" and the 2 words and the quiet of the outcrop. I wrote about what I had seen in the 8 seconds that Section 4 had asked me to document and what the addendum had technically described and what it had not been able to carry. I wrote, the standard metrics are not wrong. They are not finished. I wrote, both things are true. I watched both things be true. They were the same thing. Then I stopped writing and sat with the log open and thought about what else to say, what the last entry in a log not opened for 11 years deserved to receive, and after a while I wrote this. I had been calculating the probability of a good outcome for 11 years, from the inside of a framework that documented half a world and called it complete. The number had been very low. I had run it regularly. I had confirmed it regularly. The number had not changed because I had not changed what I was measuring. I had run the survival probability on Kareth 9 4 times before he arrived and gotten 11.4% each time. I had not run it once in the last 4 hours on that planet. I know what the number means now when it changes. I closed the log. I lay back on the Dominion Gray bunk and looked at the Dominion Gray ceiling and thought about 11.4% and about 54% and about the hand in the corridor and the 20 minutes that were now elapsed. I had already calculated the cost of hoping. I ran the number again anyway.